Hi, I'm Alex Chen. Last Christmas, my Aunt Patricia looked me straight in the eye at our family gathering and said, "Maybe you should focus on getting a real job instead of playing with computers all day." Everyone around the table laughed while I sat there in my thrift store sweater, watching my cousins flash their designer watches and luxury handbags. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just smiled politely and quietly sent a single email from my phone. Within 30 days, their entire $200 million real estate empire began crumbling. By spring, I owned $50 million of what used to be theirs. But that moment of humiliation wasn't the beginning of this story. It was the finale of years of calculated dismissal, and maybe the overture to something they never imagined possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The December rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Morrison family estate in Portland's West Hills, each droplet catching the warm glow from the chandelier that had hung in that dining room for 3 generations. I stood in the marble foyer, shaking water from my jacket while listening to the sound of expensive laughter drifting from the formal dining room. The Morrison family Christmas gathering was already in full swing, and I was 20 minutes late because my ancient Honda had trouble starting in the cold. I could smell the roasted duck and hear the gentle clink of crystal glasses, the kind of sounds that used to make me feel like I belonged somewhere. Now they just reminded me how far I'd drifted from the family that shared my blood but not my bank account. I smoothed down my black sweater, the same one I'd worn to these gatherings for the past 3 years, and walked toward the voices that would soon make it clear exactly what they thought of my place in their world. The dining room was exactly as I remembered from childhood visits to see my grandfather. The same Persian rug stretched beneath a table that could seat 16, though tonight only 8 chairs were occupied. Heavy oil paintings of Morrison ancestors gazed down from the walls, and I caught myself looking for my grandfather's face among them, remembering how he used to sneak me extra dessert when no one was watching. Patricia Morrison sat at the head of the table like she was born to command attention. At 58, she had the kind of polished elegance that comes from decades of spa treatments and personal trainers. Her silver hair was swept into a perfect chignon, and she wore my grandfather's signet ring on her right hand, the one with the Morrison family crest that he had promised would be mine someday. She looked up as I entered, and her smile was the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. To her right sat my Uncle Robert, Patricia's husband, whose contribution to most conversations was a series of thoughtful nods and strategic silences. He'd married into the Morrison name and had spent 30 years perfecting the art of agreeing with whatever Patricia decided. Across from him, my cousin Michael was deep in conversation with his wife Rachel about their recent vacation to Tuscany, gesturing with a wine glass that probably cost more than my monthly rent. My cousin Jennifer occupied the seat closest to the windows, her diamond earrings catching the light every time she turned her head. She'd married into old Seattle money and never let anyone forget it. Her husband wasn't here tonight, probably at some exclusive club or charity auction where the minimum donations started at 5 figures. Then there was David, my older brother, who looked up and offered me a genuine smile as I approached the table. David worked in sales for a pharmaceutical company and made decent money, but nothing like the Morrison family wealth. He was the only person in the room who still treated me like family instead of charity case. At the far end of the table, looking simultaneously bored and rebellious, sat Emma, Michael's 16-year-old daughter. She had her phone discreetly positioned beside her plate and was probably recording TikTok videos or texting friends about how tedious family dinners could be. Emma was the only person in the room closer to my age than my parents' generation, and sometimes I caught her rolling her eyes at the adults' conversations in a way that made me think she saw through their pretensions better than they realized. Patricia gestured to the empty chair next to Emma, and I noticed it was the only seat without a formal place setting. No gold-rimmed charger plate, no monogrammed napkin, just a simple white dinner plate that looked like it belonged in a different dining set entirely. I slid into the chair as quietly as possible, murmuring apologies for being late while Patricia continued her story about the family business's latest acquisition. Morrison Properties had been my grandfather's creation, starting with a single apartment building he bought with his army savings in 1972. Over 5 decades, he'd built it into one of the Pacific Northwest's most successful commercial real estate companies, with office towers, shopping centers, and residential complexes stretching from Vancouver to Sacramento. When he died 5 years ago, the business was worth nearly $200 million, and Patricia had seamlessly stepped into the role of family matriarch and trust administrator. What most people at this table didn't know, or chose to forget, was that I'd spent the last 3 years building the technological backbone that kept their empire running. While they saw me as the struggling family member who worked with computers, I'd actually created a sophisticated property management software system that handled everything from tenant screening to maintenance scheduling to financial reporting. Every rent payment, every lease renewal, every construction project flowed through systems I'd designed and maintained from my cramped apartment in the Pearl District. The conversation around the table flowed from business successes to vacation plans to the latest neighborhood gossip. Patricia mentioned that Morrison Properties was considering expanding into the Phoenix market, while Michael discussed his promotion to Senior Vice President of Operations. Jennifer shared news about her husband's latest philanthropic endeavor, something involving arts education for underprivileged children. I sat quietly, occasionally nodding when someone included me in their peripheral vision, but mostly observing the dynamics I'd watched play out for years. These people lived in a world where money wasn't just security or comfort, it was identity, it was proof of worth. It was the language they used to communicate love, respect, and belonging. David tried to include me in the conversation a few times, asking about my work and whether I was still living in the same apartment. His questions were kind but highlighted the gulf between my life and everyone else's at the table. When he mentioned that I'd been helping with the family business technology needs, Patricia's expression shifted slightly, like she was remembering something mildly annoying. That's when the evening took its inevitable turn toward the subject that had been hanging over every family gathering for the past 2 years. Money, inheritance, and what exactly my place was supposed to be in the Morrison legacy. Patricia set down her wine glass with the kind of deliberate motion that meant she was about to make a point. She looked directly at me with the patronizing smile I'd learned to dread, the one that preceded her most cutting observations delivered in the sweetest possible tone. The room grew quiet, that particular stillness that happens when everyone senses drama approaching but pretends they're not paying attention. Michael leaned back in his chair with a slight smirk, already anticipating whatever his mother was about to say. Jennifer adjusted her earrings and focused intently on her dessert, the kind of studied disinterest that meant she was actually listening to every word. Robert continued his methodical consumption.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Of his meal, but I noticed his chewing had slowed. David's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and I saw concern flash across his face. Emma, however, had stopped pretending to ignore the adult conversation entirely. Her phone was still beside her plate, but now she was openly watching the exchange with the sharp attention of someone who'd inherited the Morrison instinct for detecting conflict and opportunity. Patricia's voice carried across the table with the authority of someone who'd never doubted her right to judge other people's life choices. The words that followed would echo in my mind for weeks afterward, not because they hurt, but because they revealed so completely how little she understood about the person she was addressing and the power dynamics she thought she controlled. What happened next wasn't just a moment of family cruelty. It was the final miscalculation in a years-long campaign of systematic dismissal that was about to cost them everything they'd built. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to exactly how those words landed in that room full of people who thought they knew me, and what I did in the silence that followed. The chandelier above cast warm light across Patricia's face as she spoke, but her expression was anything but warm. She had that particular look that meant she was about to deliver what she considered wisdom, wrapped in the kind of condescension that wealthy relatives mistake for concern. Her manicured fingers drummed once against the mahogany table, and I knew from years of experience that she was savoring the moment before she spoke. When the words finally came, they carried the weight of every assumption she'd made about my life, my choices, and my place in the Morrison family hierarchy. The sentence hung in the air like expensive perfume, sweet on the surface but with an underlying sharpness that made you want to step away from the source. Everyone at the table heard it clearly. The gentle scrape of silverware against china stopped completely. Even the rain seemed to pause against the windows, as if nature itself was waiting to see how I would respond to being publicly diminished by the woman who controlled my family's fortune. Michael's smirk broadened into something approaching genuine amusement. Jennifer made a soft sound that might have been agreement, or might have been sympathy, though knowing Jennifer, it was probably the former. Robert continued his careful neutrality, but I caught him glancing at Patricia with something that looked like approval. David's reaction was the one that stung most. For just a moment, I saw him start to lean forward, his mouth opening as if he might actually defend me. Then his eyes flicked to Patricia, to Michael, to the accumulated weight of Morrison family money and influence, and he settled back into his chair. His expression shifted to something apologetic but resigned, the look of someone who'd chosen his battles and decided this wasn't one worth fighting. Emma, though, surprised me. Instead of the embarrassed teenager mortification I expected, she was watching the entire scene with laser focus. Her phone remained positioned beside her plate, and I noticed her thumb moving slightly across the screen. She wasn't texting or scrolling through social media, she was recording. I didn't respond immediately to Patricia's observation about my career choices and life direction. Instead, I reached for my water glass and took a careful sip, using those few seconds to process not just what had been said, but what it revealed about the entire family dynamic I'd been navigating for years. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. Patricia's confident expression began to show the first signs of uncertainty, as if she'd expected me to either defend myself or apologize for failing to meet her standards. Michael shifted in his chair, perhaps realizing that the anticipated entertainment wasn't developing as expected. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm and measured. I thanked Patricia for her concern about my career trajectory, and acknowledged that I understood her perspective on what constituted meaningful professional success. I didn't argue with her assessment, or attempt to justify my choices. I simply accepted her words with the kind of gracious dignity that my grandfather had taught me was the most powerful response to other people's cruelty. But as I spoke, my hand moved to the phone in my lap, not to text or call anyone, but to access an app that most people at this table had never seen, but that controlled every aspect of their daily business operations. With a few taps, I navigated to the administrative dashboard of Morrison Properties' property management system. The Morrison family had never bothered to understand exactly how their business functioned in the digital age. They saw the monthly reports, attended the quarterly board meetings, and celebrated the annual profit distributions, but they had no idea that every single transaction, every lease agreement, every maintenance request, every financial calculation flowed through software systems that I had built from the ground up. More importantly, they had never bothered to read the licensing agreement they'd signed 3 years earlier when I'd presented them with the completed system. The document was comprehensive, but written in technical language that they'd dismissed as programmer jargon. Their attorney had reviewed it and confirmed that it gave Morrison Properties unlimited use of the software in exchange for a modest monthly licensing fee. What the attorney hadn't emphasized, and what the family had never considered, was the termination clause buried in Section 12 of the agreement. The software license could be revoked with 30 days written notice for a variety of reasons, including but not limited to breach of licensing terms, failure to maintain agreed-upon professional relationships, or dissolution of the licensing partnership, for any reason. As Patricia continued to elaborate on her thoughts about my need for career guidance, and Michael added his own observations about the importance of financial stability, I quietly drafted an email to Morrison Properties Board of Directors. The message was brief, professional, and devastating. The email notified the board that I was exercising my right to terminate the software licensing agreement effective 30 days from the date of the message. I cited Section 12, subsection C, which addressed dissolution of licensing partnerships due to deteriorating professional relationships. I attached a copy of the original agreement and included a detailed timeline for transitioning the Morrison Properties systems to alternative software solutions. What I didn't mention in the email, because I didn't need to, was that there were no alternative software solutions. The Morrison Properties system wasn't built on some commercial platform that could be easily replaced. It was custom designed, integrated into every aspect of their operations, and absolutely essential for day-to-day business functions. Without the software, Morrison Properties couldn't process rent payments, generate financial reports, schedule maintenance, track lease renewals, or communicate with tenants. The company would effectively cease to function within days of the system going offline. They could potentially rebuild their technological infrastructure, but it would take months of development time and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, assuming they could find developers willing to reverse engineer systems they didn't understand. I finished composing the email just as Patricia concluded her thoughts on my professional development needs. The message sat in my drafts folder, ready to send with a single tap, but I didn't send it immediately. Instead, I smiled politely and thanked her again for her concern, then excused myself from the table to use the restroom. In the hallway outside the dining room, I paused to look at the family photographs that lined the walls, pictures of Morrison family celebrations, business milestones, and generational transitions. My grandfather appeared in many of the older photos, and I studied his face, remembering conversations we'd had about family, loyalty, and the difference between being related to people and being valued by them. He'd taught me that dignity wasn't something other people could give or take away. It was something you maintained regardless of how you were treated. But he'd also taught me that respect was earned through actions, not demanded through relationships. Tonight I was about to demonstrate both lessons. I returned to the dining room, just as dessert was being served, some elaborate chocolate creation that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. The conversation had moved on to holiday travel plans and speculation about the coming year's business prospects. I slid back into my seat and participated in the small talk with the same polite attention I'd maintained throughout the evening. As the meal wound down, and people began preparing to leave, I made my usual rounds of polite goodbyes. I hugged David, and promised to call him soon. I thanked Patricia and Robert for their hospitality. I waved to Michael and Jennifer, who were already discussing their exit strategy and next social obligation. Emma was the last person I spoke to, and as I approached her, she looked up from her phone with an expression I couldn't quite read. She was definitely her grandfather's great-granddaughter, with the same sharp intelligence in her eyes that I remembered from my childhood conversations with him. She stood up and hugged me, which was unusual. Emma wasn't typically demonstrative with affection, especially at family gatherings where she spent most of her energy trying to appear bored and sophisticated. As she leaned close, she whispered something that made me pause. She told me she'd recorded the entire dinner conversation, and that she thought what her grandmother had said was cruel and unfair. She said she'd been watching how the family treated me for years, and that she was sorry none of the adults seemed to notice or care. She asked if I was okay, and whether there was anything she could do to help. I told her I appreciated her concern and her loyalty, and that she shouldn't worry about adult family dynamics that weren't her responsibility to fix. But I also told her that sometimes people reveal who they really are when they think there are no consequences for their actions, and that recording tonight might turn out to be more important than she realized. I left the Morrison estate that night, driving my unreliable Honda through the December rain, but I felt different than I had arriving. Not angry, not hurt, not even particularly surprised. I felt clear. Crystal clear about what needed to happen next, and why it was not just justified but necessary. When I got back to my apartment, I poured myself a glass of wine, opened my laptop, and pulled up the email I'd drafted at dinner. I read through it one more time, checking the legal language and the technical specifications. Everything was accurate, professional, and legally sound. Then I moved the cursor to the send button and clicked. The email went out at 11:47 p.m. on December 23, arriving in the inboxes of Morrison Properties Board of Directors, with a timestamp that would later become significant in the legal proceedings that followed. By the time Patricia, Michael, and Jennifer woke up the next morning to begin their holiday celebrations, the 30-day countdown to the end of their world as they knew it had already begun. The morning of Christmas Eve arrived with the kind of crisp Portland sunshine that makes the city sparkle after winter rain. I woke up in my studio apartment, feeling more rested than I had in months, despite staying up past midnight sending what would soon become the most expensive email in Morrison family history. The coffee maker gurgled to life while I checked my phone for responses to the licensing termination notice I'd sent 12 hours earlier. Nothing yet. The Morrison Properties Board consisted of Patricia, Robert, Michael, and 2 outside advisors who probably wouldn't check their email until after the holidays. Corporate governance moved slowly during the best of times, and Christmas week was traditionally when wealthy families focused on celebration rather than business crisis management. I spent Christmas Eve morning organizing my apartment and preparing for what I knew would be several intense weeks ahead. My laptop sat open on the kitchen counter, displaying the Morrison Properties administrative dashboard that still showed my access credentials in green. For now, everything functioned normally. Rent payments processed automatically, maintenance requests routed to appropriate contractors, financial reports generated according to their usual schedules. But that 30-day clock was ticking, and I wanted to document everything carefully. I began creating detailed screenshots of every system component, every data structure, every automated process that kept Morrison Properties running smoothly. Not because I planned to sabotage anything, but because I wanted a complete record of exactly what the family was about to lose through their own arrogance. The property management system I'd built wasn't just software. It was 3 years of unpaid overtime, weekends spent debugging code, late nights integrating financial platforms, and countless hours training Morrison Properties staff to use tools they never bothered to understand. The system managed 47 commercial properties, 32 residential buildings, and over 3,000 individual lease agreements. It processed approximately $2 million in monthly rent payments and coordinated maintenance for everything from elevator repairs to landscaping contracts. More importantly, the system contained proprietary algorithms I'd developed for predicting market trends, optimizing rent pricing, and identifying profitable investment opportunities. Morrison Properties had been using my predictive models to make acquisition decisions worth tens of millions of dollars, treating my analytical work as just another business resource they were entitled to exploit indefinitely. My phone rang around noon, interrupting my documentation process. David's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with genuine curiosity about what he might want to discuss the day after our family gathering. David's voice carried a tension I hadn't heard during dinner the night before. He asked if I had a few minutes to talk, then immediately launched into what sounded like a carefully rehearsed conversation about family relationships and the importance of maintaining connections despite occasional misunderstandings. He said Patricia had called him that morning, concerned that I might have left dinner feeling hurt or upset by what she'd characterized as constructive career advice. David explained that Patricia wanted to make sure I understood her comments came from a place of caring rather than criticism, and that she hoped I wouldn't let any perceived slight damage my relationship with the family. The conversation revealed several fascinating things about Morrison family dynamics. First, Patricia was worried enough about my reaction to reach out to David as an intermediary, which suggested she recognized her comments had crossed some kind of line. Second, she'd chosen to frame her concern as worry about my emotional response, rather than acknowledgement that her behavior had been inappropriate. Third, she was already working to control the narrative and manage potential fallout from what she probably saw as a minor family drama. I told David I appreciated his concern and Patricia's outreach, but that I wasn't upset or hurt by anything that had happened at dinner. I explained that I understood exactly how the family viewed my career choices and financial situation, and that clarity was actually helpful rather than harmful. David seemed relieved by my calm response, though I noticed he didn't address the substance of what Patricia had said or suggest that her comments might have been unfair. Before ending the call, David mentioned that the family was planning their annual New Year's gathering at the Multnomah Athletic Club and hoped I would join them. The invitation felt like both an olive branch and a test, a way to gauge whether I would continue participating in family events, despite being systematically reminded of my lower status. I told David I would think about attending, and let him know closer to the date. What I didn't mention was that New Year's Eve would fall right in the middle of my 30-day termination timeline, and by then the Morrison family would be dealing with business complications that would make party planning seem trivial by comparison. After the call ended, I returned to my laptop and began exploring a different aspect of the Morrison Properties system. Beyond the property management functions, I'd also built comprehensive financial reporting tools that integrated with the family trust's accounting systems. The trust structure my grandfather had established was complex, designed to minimize tax liability while providing steady income distribution to family members. What I discovered during my afternoon of careful investigation was that the financial integration went deeper than I'd remembered. The trust's quarterly distributions were calculated automatically based on property performance metrics generated by my software. Investment decisions were influenced by market analysis reports my algorithms produced. Even the trust's annual tax filings relied on data compilations my systems created. This meant that terminating the software licensing agreement wouldn't just disrupt Morrison Properties' day-to-day operations. It would also compromise the trust's ability to function effectively, potentially triggering all kinds of legal and financial complications for the family members who depended on trust distributions for their comfortable lifestyles. I spent the rest of Christmas Eve creating a comprehensive analysis of exactly how much the Morrison family had saved in development costs, consulting fees, and operational expenses by using my systems instead of purchasing commercial alternatives. The numbers were staggering. Over 3 years, they'd avoided spending approximately $800,000 on software licensing, $400,000 on system development, and another $300,000 on ongoing technical support. In essence, my unpaid contributions had subsidized the Morrison family lifestyle to the tune of $1.5 million, while they treated me like a charity case who couldn't figure out how to make money with computers. Christmas Day passed quietly. I ignored several texts from family members wishing me happy holidays, not out of spite, but because I was entering a mental space where social pleasantries felt increasingly irrelevant. I was transitioning from family member to business adversary, and that shift required different kinds of focus and preparation. I spent most of the day reading legal documents related to software licensing, contract termination, and family trust administration. I wanted to understand exactly what rights I had, what obligations the Morrison family had, and what potential complications might arise when my termination notice began generating real-world consequences. The most interesting discovery came from reviewing my grandfather's original trust documents, which I'd never seen in their entirety. My father had been designated as one of the original trustees, but he died in a car accident when I was 12, before the trust became active. His trustee position had passed to Patricia by default, since she was the oldest surviving family member and had been involved in managing my grandfather's business interests for decades. But the trust documents also contained provisions for situations where trustee decisions might conflict with beneficiary interests. If a beneficiary could demonstrate that trustee actions were harming their inheritance prospects or violating their grandfather's intentions, they could petition for trustee review or replacement. Even more interesting, the trust documents specifically mentioned technology assets and intellectual property as protected inheritance categories. My grandfather had been remarkably forward-thinking about digital assets, perhaps because he'd watched other family businesses struggle with technology transitions. The implications were becoming clear. Patricia's systematic dismissal of my contributions wasn't just personally insulting. It might actually constitute breach of her fiduciary duty as trustee, especially if I could demonstrate that my technological contributions had enhanced trust value while being deliberately undercompensated. I made notes about potentially engaging a trust attorney after the first of the year, but I wasn't ready to escalate to legal action yet. I wanted to see how the Morrison family responded to losing their technological infrastructure before deciding whether additional pressure would be necessary. December 26th brought the first indication that my email was starting to generate attention. Margaret Wu, the family accountant who'd been managing Morrison Properties books for over 20 years, called my phone at 8 in the morning with a level of urgency I'd never heard in her voice before. Margaret had always treated me with professional respect, probably because she understood better than the family members how essential my systems were to their operations. She'd worked with me directly on integrating financial reporting functions and had often complimented the sophistication of my analytical tools. Her call was ostensibly about year-end reporting requirements, but it quickly became clear she was fishing for information about my termination notice. She asked whether I was planning any changes to the software systems during the transition to the new year, and whether there were any technical issues the family should be aware of. I told Margaret I'd sent detailed information to the board about upcoming changes to the licensing agreement, and that she should probably contact Patricia or Michael for guidance about how they wanted to handle the transition. Margaret's silence on the other end of the line told me she was beginning to understand the scope of the problem the Morrison family was about to face. Before ending the call, Margaret asked if I'd be available for consulting work if the family needed help managing the software transition. Her question confirmed that she'd grasped what Patricia, Michael, and the others had not yet comprehended. There was no easy transition. There was no simple replacement for systems that had been custom-built over 3 years of intensive development. I told Margaret I'd consider consulting opportunities, but that my rates for external clients were significantly higher than what I'd been charging for family work. I suggested she might want to discuss budget expectations with the family before making any specific arrangements. The rest of that week passed in a strange state of suspended animation. I continued monitoring the Morrison Properties systems, watching the normal flow of business operations while knowing that everything would change dramatically within a few weeks. I felt like someone watching a slow-motion disaster unfold, with the unique perspective of being both observer and catalyst. My phone rang several more times with calls from family members, but I noticed the tone was shifting. David called again, this time asking more direct questions about my computer work for the family business. Jennifer left a voicemail mentioning that she'd heard I was making some changes and wondering if we should get together to discuss family matters. Even Robert, who rarely initiated conversations with anyone, sent me a text message asking if I was planning anything that might affect the business. The increasing attention told me that word was spreading within the Morrison family about the termination notice, even though I hadn't received any official responses from the board yet. The most revealing communication came from Michael, who called me on December 29th with barely concealed frustration in his voice. He said he'd heard from Margaret that I was threatening to shut down the family systems and wanted to understand what I thought I was trying to accomplish. Michael's call was the first direct acknowledgement that the family was beginning to grasp the implications of my termination notice. His tone combined indignation with confusion, as if he couldn't understand why someone would voluntarily give up the privilege of providing free technical support to Morrison Properties. I explained to Michael that I wasn't threatening anything. I was simply exercising contractual rights that had been clearly outlined in the licensing agreement his family had signed 3 years earlier. I told him that business relationships sometimes change, and that I'd decided to focus my technical expertise on projects that offered better compensation and professional recognition. Michael's response revealed the depth of Morrison family entitlement. He said the family had always treated me well, and that I was being unreasonable to expect formal business arrangements for helping family members. He suggested that my decision was motivated by emotional immaturity, rather than legitimate business concerns. The conversation confirmed everything I'd suspected about how the Morrison family viewed my contributions. In their minds, my work wasn't valuable professional service that deserved appropriate compensation. It was family obligation that I should feel grateful to provide, regardless of how they treated me personally. I told Michael I understood his perspective, but that my decision was final. I suggested he work with Margaret to identify alternative software solutions and begin planning for the transition that would be required after the termination became effective. By December 30th, the Morrison family panic was becoming obvious. I received 6 phone calls that day, including 3 from Patricia herself. She left increasingly frustrated voicemails asking me to call her back immediately to discuss this ridiculous misunderstanding about computer contracts. The final voicemail, left at nearly 10 p.m., was Patricia at her most imperious. She said she expected me to attend the New Year's gathering at the Multnomah Athletic Club so we could resolve this situation like adults. She said the family wouldn't tolerate me holding the business hostage over hurt feelings, and that I needed to remember who had provided me with opportunities to contribute to something meaningful. Patricia's messages revealed how completely she misunderstood both the situation and my motivations. She still thought this was about emotional hurt rather than business decisions. She still believed she had the authority to demand my compliance through family pressure. Most tellingly, she still hadn't grasped that I wasn't asking for anything from the family. I was simply withdrawing my subsidization of their lifestyle. That night, I made my final preparations for what would happen when the 30-day clock ran down. I created detailed documentation of every Morrison Properties system component, organized all contractual and legal materials related to the licensing agreement, and prepared a comprehensive transition plan that would minimize operational disruption if the family chose to cooperate with the termination process. I also did something that felt both symbolic and practical. I drove to my grandfather's gravesite in Riverview Cemetery and spent an hour walking among the headstones, thinking about legacy, family, and the difference between being related to people and being valued by them. My grandfather had built Morrison Properties from nothing, working 16-hour days and reinvesting every profit back into the business for decades. He'd created wealth not just for himself, but for future generations of his family, establishing the trust that would provide financial security for his children and grandchildren long after he was gone. But he'd also valued innovation, hard work, and treating people with dignity regardless of their position in the family hierarchy. I remembered conversations where he'd talked about the importance of earning respect through actions rather than demanding it through relationships. Standing beside his grave in the cold December air, I felt confident that my grandfather would have understood and supported what I was about to do. The Morrison family had forgotten his values in their pursuit of maintaining their privileged positions. They'd mistaken inheritance for entitlement and confused financial security with personal worth. On New Year's Eve, I received a text message from Emma, Michael's daughter, asking if I was planning to attend the family gathering. I told her I wouldn't be joining them but wished her a happy new year. Emma responded with something that surprised me. She said she'd been thinking about our conversation after the Christmas dinner, and that she'd decided to spend New Year's Eve with friends instead of attending the family party. She said watching the adults treat me poorly had made her realize she didn't want to be part of family traditions that were based on excluding or dismissing people. Her message reminded me that my actions weren't just about settling scores with Patricia, Michael, and the others. They were also about demonstrating to the younger generation that dignity and self-respect were more important than maintaining relationships with people who didn't value you. As midnight approached and the new year began, I received one final call from Patricia. This time, her voice was different. The imperious tone was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like pleading. She said the family had discussed the situation and realized there might have been misunderstandings about my role in the business. She said they were prepared to make adjustments to ensure I felt properly appreciated for my technical contributions. Patricia offered me a formal consulting contract with Morrison Properties, including retroactive payment for previous work and a guaranteed monthly retainer for ongoing system maintenance. She said the family valued my expertise and wanted to find a way to continue working together professionally. For the first time in the conversation, Patricia sounded like she was talking to me as a business equal rather than a family charity case. But her offer came exactly 1 week before my termination notice would take effect, and I knew it was motivated by panic rather than genuine recognition of my worth. I told Patricia I appreciated the offer, but that I'd already made commitments for the new year that would prevent me from continuing to support Morrison Properties systems. I suggested she work quickly to identify alternative solutions, since the transition deadline was approaching rapidly. Patricia's response was immediate and telling. She said the family was prepared to take legal action if I tried to sabotage the business out of spite. She said they had lawyers who would ensure I couldn't destroy what other people had built. The legal threat confirmed that Patricia still didn't understand the situation. She thought I was trying to harm the family business, when in reality I was simply withdrawing my voluntary support for their operations. She couldn't conceive that someone might choose to stop providing services that weren't being fairly compensated. I told Patricia that any legal questions should be directed to the contract her family had signed, which clearly outlined the terms and conditions of the software licensing agreement. I reminded her that I'd provided 30 days' notice as required, and that the termination process was proceeding exactly according to the contractual framework her own attorneys had approved. As I ended the call and prepared for sleep in the early hours of January 1st, I realized that the most challenging part of this entire process wasn't the technical complexity of shutting down the systems or the legal complications of contract termination. The most challenging part was watching people I'd known my entire life reveal who they really were when their comfort and security were threatened. The Morrison family had shown me their true priorities, and I was no longer surprised or hurt by their choices. I was simply prepared to show them the consequences. January 2nd arrived with the kind of gray Portland drizzle that seemed to mirror the Morrison family's growing desperation. My phone had been ringing constantly since sunrise, but I let most calls go to voicemail while I prepared for what would be the most revealing day in this entire saga. The 30-day termination clock was winding down, and the Morrison family was about to discover that their attempts at intimidation and manipulation had only strengthened my resolve to follow through with my decision. The first call I actually answered came from someone unexpected. Margaret Wu sounded exhausted when she reached me at 9 in the morning, her usually composed professional demeanor strained to the breaking point. She explained that she'd spent the weekend trying to understand the scope of what would happen when my systems went offline, and that the reality was far worse than anyone in the family had imagined. Margaret had been working with Morrison Properties for over 2 decades, and she understood their operations better than Patricia, Michael, or any of the other family members who made policy decisions from their comfortable distance. She'd seen how completely dependent the business had become on my technological infrastructure, and she was the first person to grasp that this wasn't a negotiation or a temporary disruption. This was an existential threat to everything the Morrison family had built their lives around. She told me she'd spent her weekend calling software companies, trying to find commercial alternatives that could replace my custom systems. The conversations had been illuminating in ways that must have been deeply uncomfortable for someone as methodical and solution-oriented as Margaret. Every company she'd contacted had explained that replacing custom-built property management systems wasn't like switching email providers or upgrading accounting software. It required months of development work, extensive data migration, staff retraining, and integration with existing financial and legal systems. The cost estimates she'd received ranged from $300,000 to $800,000, depending on the complexity of the replacement systems and the speed of the implementation timeline. But even more concerning than the expense was the time requirement. The fastest any company could promise to deliver a functioning replacement was 6 to 8 months, and that assumed perfect cooperation from all stakeholders and no unexpected technical complications. Margaret's voice carried a weight of professional concern that went beyond her loyalty to the Morrison family. She'd built her reputation on maintaining smooth operations and preventing business crises, and she was watching a disaster unfold that she was powerless to stop. She asked me directly whether there was any possibility of extending the termination deadline or negotiating some kind of transition arrangement that would give Morrison Properties time to develop alternative solutions. I told Margaret I appreciated her professionalism and her genuine concern for business continuity, but that my decision was final. I explained that I'd given the family 30 days' notice as required by our licensing agreement, and that they'd chosen to spend most of that time trying to pressure me into changing my mind rather than preparing for the transition. I suggested that their current crisis was the predictable result of taking essential business infrastructure for granted while simultaneously treating the person who built it with dismissive contempt. Margaret was quiet for a long moment after I finished speaking, and I could hear her processing the implications of what I'd said. Finally, she asked whether I would be willing to work with Morrison Properties as an external consultant to help manage the transition process and minimize operational disruption during the changeover period. Her question was the first reasonable business proposition anyone from the Morrison family orbit had presented since this entire situation began. Margaret wasn't trying to guilt me, or threaten me, or appeal to family loyalty. She was acknowledging that I had valuable expertise and offering to compensate me appropriately for my services. I told Margaret I would consider consulting work, but that my rates for external clients were significantly higher than what I'd been charging for family projects. I quoted her a figure that represented fair market value for my technical skills and the specialized knowledge I'd developed about Morrison Properties' unique operational requirements. The number was approximately 10 times what the family had been paying for my services, which put it in line with what other Portland businesses paid for comparable technical consulting. Margaret didn't flinch at the rate I quoted, which told me she understood exactly how much the family had been saving by exploiting our relationship rather than paying professional fees. She said she would need to discuss the consulting option with the board, but that she wanted to schedule a meeting as soon as possible to talk through the technical requirements for a managed transition. After ending the call with Margaret, I spent the rest of the morning documenting the current state of Morrison Properties systems and preparing detailed transition materials that would help them understand exactly what they were losing and what would be required to replace it. The documentation process was revealing in ways I hadn't anticipated, forcing me to catalog 3 years of unpaid work and quantify the value I'd been providing to people who treated me like an incompetent charity case. The property management system included over 50,000 lines of custom code, integrated databases containing more than a decade of operational history, and automated processes that handled everything from tenant communications to predictive maintenance scheduling. I'd built machine learning algorithms that optimized rent pricing based on market conditions, developed reporting tools that provided insights into investment opportunities, and created security systems that protected sensitive tenant and financial information from cyber threats. Beyond the software components, I'd also provided ongoing technical support, system updates, security patches, data backups, and troubleshooting services that kept everything running smoothly 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The Morrison family had never needed to think about server maintenance, software updates, or system security because I'd been handling all of those responsibilities invisibly and without compensation. The economic value of my contributions became startlingly clear as I worked through the documentation. Conservative estimates suggested that purchasing equivalent commercial software and support services would cost Morrison Properties approximately $40,000 per month, or nearly $500,000 per year. Over 3 years, I'd essentially provided the family with $1.5 million worth of professional technical services, while they paid me less than $50,000 in total. But the financial calculations only captured part of the story. The Morrison Properties system wasn't just expensive to replace because of its technical complexity, it was valuable because it had been designed specifically for their business model, their operational workflows, and their strategic objectives. I understood how Patricia made decisions, how Michael approached problem solving, how the various property managers preferred to receive information, and how the family's investment strategy had evolved over time. A commercial replacement system would provide generic functionality designed to serve many different types of businesses. It wouldn't include the customizations, optimizations, and specialized features that made Morrison Properties more efficient and profitable than their competitors. The family wasn't just losing software, they were losing a competitive advantage that I'd built for them through intimate knowledge of their business and dedication to their success. My phone rang again around noon, and this time, the caller was someone I hadn't expected to hear from. Jennifer Morrison Hayes, Michael's sister, who had married into Seattle society money, rarely involved herself in family business matters. She typically attended Morrison gatherings as a social obligation rather than showing genuine interest in the operations that funded her comfortable lifestyle. Jennifer's voice carried a nervous energy I'd never heard before, as if she was venturing into unfamiliar territory but felt compelled to make the effort. She said she'd been talking with Michael about the computer situation and wanted to understand what was happening from my perspective. She asked whether we could meet for coffee to discuss things privately, away from the family drama that was apparently consuming everyone's attention. The invitation was intriguing because Jennifer had never previously shown any interest in my opinions or experiences. She'd always been politely distant at family gatherings, acknowledging my presence with the kind of superficial friendliness that wealthy people use to demonstrate their good manners without actually engaging with people they consider beneath their social level. I agreed to meet Jennifer the following afternoon at a coffee shop in downtown Portland, curious about what might motivate her to suddenly seek direct conversation about family matters. Her request for privacy suggested she might be operating independently from Patricia and Michael, which could indicate cracks developing in the Morrison family's unified response to my termination decision. The rest of January 2nd passed, with a steady stream of voicemails from various family members, each message revealing different levels of understanding about the seriousness of their situation. Robert left a brief, awkward message asking if I needed anything and suggesting that family problems should be worked out through calm discussion. David called twice, once to check on my well-being, and once to relay a message from Patricia about the importance of keeping family business within the family. But the most interesting communication came from Emma, Michael's 16-year-old daughter, who sent me a text message that included a screenshot from the Morrison family WhatsApp group. The image showed a conversation thread where Patricia, Michael, Jennifer, and Robert were discussing strategy for dealing with what Patricia referred to as my technical tantrum. The messages revealed that the family was still fundamentally misunderstanding both my motivations and their options. Patricia had written that I was acting out for attention and that they needed to call my bluff by showing me they wouldn't be manipulated by emotional blackmail. Michael had suggested that I was probably having some kind of breakdown and that they should consider whether I needed professional help rather than business negotiations. Jennifer's contributions to the thread were more pragmatic, focusing on the potential financial implications if I actually followed through with the system shutdown. She'd apparently done some research into software replacement costs and was trying to convince the others that they should take my termination notice seriously rather than treating it as a family relationship issue. Robert's messages were brief and non-committal, mostly consisting of agreement with whatever Patricia had said most recently. His contributions revealed that he was following his usual pattern of avoiding conflict while supporting whatever position seemed most likely to maintain family harmony. But the most telling aspect of the WhatsApp thread was what wasn't being discussed. None of the family members had acknowledged that their treatment of me might have been inappropriate or unfair. None of them had suggested that I might have legitimate grievances about being undercompensated for professional work. None of them had proposed actually addressing the underlying issues that had led to my termination decision. Instead, they were focused entirely on managing what they saw as a crisis of my emotional instability rather than recognizing it as a consequence of their own actions and attitudes. They were treating me like a problem to be solved, rather than a person whose expertise and dignity they had systematically devalued. Emma's decision to share the screenshots with me was significant for several reasons. It demonstrated that she understood the adults in her family were behaving poorly, and that she wanted me to know she didn't support their approach. It provided me with valuable intelligence about their strategy and mindset, which would help me prepare for whatever tactics they might attempt in the coming days. Most importantly, it confirmed that the Morrison family was continuing to make the same mistakes that had created this situation in the first place. They were so convinced of their own importance and so accustomed to having their preferences accommodated that they couldn't imagine someone might simply choose to stop providing services they weren't properly valuing. January 3rd brought my meeting with Jennifer at a trendy coffee shop in Portland's Pearl District, not far from my apartment. I arrived a few minutes early and chose a table near the window where we could talk privately without being overheard by other customers. Jennifer appeared precisely on time, dressed in the kind of carefully casual outfit that cost more than most people's monthly rent but was designed to look effortlessly stylish. Jennifer's demeanor was different than I'd ever seen before. She seemed nervous but determined, like someone who had decided to have a difficult conversation but wasn't entirely sure how to begin. She ordered an expensive coffee drink with multiple customizations, which gave her a few extra minutes to organize her thoughts while we waited for her order to be prepared. When she finally sat down across from me, Jennifer's first words were surprisingly direct. She said she'd been watching the family's response to my termination notice and had concluded that Patricia and Michael were handling the situation poorly. She said she wanted to apologize for her own failure to recognize the value of my contributions to Morrison Properties and to discuss whether there might be ways to resolve the current crisis that would benefit everyone involved. Jennifer's apology seemed genuine, though I suspected it was motivated more by practical concerns than by sudden moral awakening. She'd done enough research into software replacement costs to understand that my departure would be financially devastating for the family, and she was probably worried about how the crisis might affect her own inheritance prospects. She asked me to explain exactly what would happen when my systems went offline, and I walked her through the operational consequences in detail. Without the property management software, Morrison Properties would lose the ability to process rent payments, generate financial reports, schedule maintenance, communicate with tenants, or track lease renewals. The company would essentially cease to function within days of the system's shutdown. Jennifer listened carefully to my explanation, asking technical questions that revealed she was taking the situation more seriously than the other family members. She wanted to understand the timeline for system replacement, the cost implications of different transition strategies, and the potential legal complications that might arise from operational disruptions. Her questions demonstrated that she was the first family member to approach this crisis as a business problem rather than a relationship drama. She wasn't trying to guilt me or threaten me or appeal to family loyalty. She was trying to understand the facts so she could make informed decisions about how to respond. After I finished explaining the technical aspects of the situation, Jennifer leaned back in her chair and was quiet for several minutes. Finally, she said that she thought the family had made serious mistakes in how they'd treated me over the years, and that those mistakes were now threatening everything my grandfather had built. She said she'd been reflecting on family dynamics since receiving my termination notice, and that she'd realized how often the family had dismissed my contributions while benefiting from my work. She acknowledged that the financial arrangements had been unfair and that the family's attitude toward my technical expertise had been both disrespectful and short-sighted. Jennifer's recognition of the family's problematic behavior was refreshing, but I remained skeptical about her motivations. She was facing the potential loss of significant inheritance value, and her newfound concern for fairness might be more about protecting her financial interests than about genuine moral growth. When I expressed my skepticism, Jennifer surprised me by acknowledging exactly what I was thinking. She said she knew her apology might seem self-interested given the timing, and that I had every right to question whether her concerns were genuine. But she said she also thought it was possible for people to do the right thing for multiple reasons, including both moral and practical considerations. She proposed a solution that was more creative than anything I'd heard from the other family members. Instead of trying to convince me to reverse my termination decision or extend the deadline, she suggested that I consider becoming a full business partner in Morrison Properties rather than just a service provider. Jennifer's proposal involved restructuring the business relationship to give me an ownership stake that would reflect the true value of my contributions. She suggested that I could maintain control over the technological infrastructure while receiving equity compensation that would make me a genuine partner in the family enterprise rather than an undervalued contractor. The partnership proposal was intriguing because it addressed the underlying issues that had led to my termination decision. Instead of asking me to continue providing undercompensated services to people who didn't respect my work, Jennifer was suggesting a framework that would give me both financial compensation and decision-making authority commensurate with my contributions. But I was also aware that Jennifer might not have the authority to negotiate such an arrangement without approval from Patricia, Michael, and the other family members. The Morrison family trust was complex, and any significant restructuring would probably require unanimous consent from all trustees and beneficiaries. I told Jennifer I was interested in discussing partnership arrangements, but that any serious negotiations would need to include all family members, and would need to address both past undercompensation and future working relationships. I said I wasn't willing to continue the pattern of providing valuable services to people who treated me with contempt, regardless of how the financial terms might be adjusted. Jennifer nodded and said she understood my concerns about respect and professional treatment. She said she'd been observing family dynamics for years, and had noticed how dismissively Patricia and Michael often spoke about my work, despite depending on it completely for their business operations. She asked whether I would be willing to attend a family meeting to discuss partnership possibilities, with the understanding that the conversation would focus on business arrangements rather than personal relationships. She said she thought she could convince the others to approach the discussion professionally rather than emotionally, though she acknowledged that Patricia might resist any arrangement that reduced her control over family business decisions. I agreed to consider a family meeting, but only if certain conditions were met. The discussion would need to be conducted as a business negotiation rather than a family intervention. All participants would need to acknowledge the value of my contributions and agree to discuss compensation arrangements based on market rates rather than family discounts. And any agreement would need to include specific protections against the kind of dismissive treatment that had created the current crisis. Jennifer said she thought those conditions were reasonable and that she would work on organizing a meeting that could satisfy my requirements. She said she wanted to give the family one chance to respond constructively to the situation before I followed through with the system termination. As we finished our coffee and prepared to leave, Jennifer made one final comment that stayed with me long after our conversation ended. She said she'd been thinking about what my grandfather would have wanted for the family and the business he'd built, and that she didn't think he would have approved of how I'd been treated over the years. She said my grandfather had always emphasized the importance of recognizing and rewarding people who contributed to the family's success, regardless of their formal position in the hierarchy. She thought he would have been disappointed to see his descendants taking valuable contributions for granted while simultaneously diminishing the people who provided them. Jennifer's invocation of my grandfather's values resonated with me because it acknowledged the broader principles that were at stake in this conflict. This wasn't just about money or software or business arrangements, it was about whether the Morrison family would honor the values that had made their success possible in the first place. I left the coffee shop feeling more optimistic about the possibility of constructive resolution than I had since sending the termination notice. Jennifer had demonstrated that at least one family member was capable of approaching the situation with maturity, honesty, and genuine concern for fairness, but I also remained realistic about the challenges that lay ahead. Patricia and Michael had spent years developing patterns of entitlement and dismissiveness that wouldn't change easily. Robert had shown no indication that he was willing to challenge family dynamics that had served his interests well, and even Jennifer's apparent growth might not survive the pressure of family loyalty and financial self-interest. The next few days would reveal whether the Morrison family was capable of the kind of fundamental change that would be required to repair our relationship and preserve their business empire. I was prepared for the possibility that they would choose pride over pragmatism, and that I would need to follow through with my termination decision regardless of the consequences for people I'd known my entire life. But I was also genuinely hopeful that Jennifer's influence might create space for a different kind of conversation, one that could lead to outcomes that honored both my grandfather's values and my own need for dignity and fair compensation. The Morrison family empire hung in the balance, and for the first time since this crisis began, I thought there might be a path forward that didn't require its complete destruction. The family meeting that Jennifer arranged took place on January 10th at Morrison Properties headquarters, in the same conference room where I'd attended countless board meetings over the years as an unpaid technical advisor. The irony wasn't lost on me as I walked through the familiar glass doors, past the reception desk where I'd once been introduced as the computer expert, into the executive suite where my contributions had been consistently minimized while my services were quietly exploited. Patricia sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, flanked by Michael and Robert in a formation that seemed designed to project authority and unity. Jennifer occupied a chair along the side, positioned carefully between the family power structure and the empty seat that had been designated for me. Margaret Wu sat near the far end with a stack of financial documents, her expression professionally neutral but her eyes betraying the stress of someone who understood exactly how much was at stake in this conversation. The atmosphere in the room was unlike any previous Morrison family gathering I'd experienced. There was no casual small talk, no discussion of weekend plans or social events. Patricia's usual commanding presence seemed forced, as if she was working harder than usual to maintain control over a situation that was slipping beyond her management capabilities. Michael appeared restless and frustrated, checking his phone repeatedly and avoiding direct eye contact. Robert maintained his customary silence, but his posture suggested tension rather than relaxed deference. Patricia opened the meeting with what she clearly intended as a magnanimous gesture of reconciliation. She said the family had been discussing my concerns about recognition and compensation, and that they were prepared to make adjustments that would address any misunderstandings about my value to Morrison Properties. Her tone carried the patronizing warmth of someone offering forgiveness to a wayward child, as if my termination notice had been an emotional outburst rather than a calculated business decision. She outlined a proposal that demonstrated how completely the Morrison family still misunderstood both my motivations and my position. They were prepared to increase my monthly consulting fee by 50%, provide formal recognition of my technical expertise in company materials, and include me in quarterly business planning meetings where my input would be properly valued and considered. The offer represented exactly the kind of incremental concession that wealthy families make when they're forced to acknowledge someone's contributions but don't want to fundamentally alter existing power structures. Patricia was proposing to treat me slightly better while maintaining complete control over business decisions, financial arrangements, and family hierarchy. I listened to the entire presentation without interruption, taking notes on the specific terms and conditions Patricia outlined. When she finished speaking, she looked at me expectantly, clearly anticipating that I would express gratitude for the family's willingness to meet me halfway on what she continued to characterize as a relationship issue rather than a business dispute. My response was calm, professional, and devastating. I thanked Patricia for the proposal and acknowledged the effort the family had put into developing what they saw as a reasonable compromise. Then I pulled out the comprehensive analysis I'd prepared documenting the true value of my contributions to Morrison Properties over the past 3 years. The numbers told a story that was impossible to dismiss or minimize. I'd provided services worth approximately $1.5 million in exchange for compensation totaling less than $50,000. The property management systems I'd built had generated operational savings of over $800,000 compared to commercial alternatives. The predictive analytics tools I'd developed had identified investment opportunities that had increased the trust's value by more than $2 million. Patricia's proposed 50% increase in my consulting fee would bring my annual compensation to approximately $25,000, which remained less than 5% of the market value of the services I provided. The formal recognition she'd offered was meaningless without decision-making authority or equity participation. The quarterly meetings were tokenism designed to make me feel included without actually giving me influence over business strategy. I explained that I wasn't interested in incremental improvements to an exploitative arrangement. I was terminating my services because the fundamental relationship was unfair and unsustainable, not because I needed slightly better terms within the existing power structure. The silence that followed my presentation was profound. Margaret Wu was the first to speak, confirming the accuracy of my financial analysis and adding additional details about operational dependencies that I hadn't included in my calculations. Her professional assessment made it clear that losing my systems would be catastrophic for Morrison Properties, regardless of the family's feelings about business relationships or compensation philosophy. Michael's response revealed the depth of Morrison family entitlement and their inability to grasp basic principles of fair exchange. He said the family had given me opportunities to contribute to something meaningful, and that I was being ungrateful for the experience and connections they'd provided. He suggested that my financial calculations ignored the intangible benefits of being associated with a successful family business and learning from experienced professionals. His comments demonstrated that the Morrison family still viewed my work as a privilege I should appreciate rather than professional services that deserved appropriate compensation. They couldn't conceive that someone might value dignity and fair treatment more than the supposed honor of being exploited by wealthy relatives. Jennifer attempted to redirect the conversation toward more constructive territory, acknowledging that my analysis raised legitimate concerns about compensation equity and suggesting that the family needed to consider more significant restructuring of our business relationship. But Patricia cut her off with a sharp look and a reminder that she remained the senior decision-maker for Morrison Properties and the family trust. Patricia's response to my presentation was a masterpiece of aristocratic outrage. She said she was disappointed by my mercenary attitude and my failure to understand that family relationships transcended simple financial calculations. She suggested that my demands for market-rate compensation revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how family businesses operated and what loyalty meant in the context of generational wealth. She said the Morrison family had always treated me fairly, and that my current position was the result of my own failure to demonstrate the kind of leadership qualities that would justify greater responsibility and compensation. She characterized my termination notice as emotional manipulation designed to extort money from people who had only shown me kindness and support. Patricia's speech revealed everything I needed to know about whether constructive resolution was possible. She wasn't capable of acknowledging that the family had undervalued my contributions or treated me unfairly. She couldn't recognize that my termination decision was based on legitimate business grievances rather than emotional instability. Most importantly, she had no intention of addressing the underlying issues that had created this crisis. I stood up, gathered my materials, and prepared to leave the meeting. Before walking out, I made one final statement that crystallized everything this conflict represented. I told the Morrison family that my grandfather had built their empire through hard work, innovation, and fair dealing with everyone who contributed to his success. I said he'd taught me that dignity wasn't negotiable, and that self-respect was more valuable than other people's approval. I explained that I was withdrawing my services not to hurt them, but to honor the principles he'd instilled in me. I reminded them that the termination notice would take effect in 5 days, and that they should use that time to prepare for the operational transition rather than continuing to debate whether my decision was justified. I suggested they contact Margaret Wu if they needed technical documentation to help with system replacement efforts. As I reached the conference room door, Patricia made one final attempt to assert control over the situation. She said the family would not be intimidated by threats or manipulation, and that they had legal resources to protect their business interests if I attempted to sabotage Morrison Properties out of spite. Her threat revealed that she still completely misunderstood the situation. I wasn't threatening to sabotage anything. I was simply withdrawing my voluntary support for their operations according to the terms of a contract their own attorneys had approved. The distinction was crucial, and her inability to grasp it demonstrated why constructive resolution had always been impossible. I walked out of Morrison Properties headquarters knowing that I would never return as an employee, contractor, or family member seeking approval from people who were incapable of recognizing my worth. The termination would proceed as scheduled, and the Morrison family would face the consequences of their systematic dismissal of someone whose contributions had been essential to their success. The final 5 days before the termination took effect passed in a whirlwind of increasingly desperate communications from various Morrison family members. Patricia left voicemails alternating between renewed offers of compromise and threats of legal action. Michael sent text messages suggesting that I was having some kind of breakdown and needed professional help. Robert made awkward attempts at casual conversation designed to gauge whether I might be willing to reconsider my decision. But the most interesting development came from Emma, who sent me a series of messages that revealed how the crisis was affecting the younger generation of the Morrison family. She said the adults were in constant meetings and phone conferences, trying to figure out how to replace systems they'd never bothered to understand. She said Patricia was talking about hiring expensive consultants, and Michael was suggesting they might need to sell some properties to fund the technological transition. Emma also shared that she'd been accepted to Portland State University's computer science program and was planning to study software development and business technology. She said watching this crisis unfold had convinced her that she needed to understand the technical aspects of modern business rather than assuming other people would always handle the complicated details. Her decision to pursue technical education represented a fundamental shift in Morrison family thinking. For the first time in generations, a family member was acknowledging that technological expertise was essential rather than peripheral to business success. Emma's choice validated everything I'd been trying to demonstrate about the value of technical contributions and the importance of treating technology professionals with appropriate respect. January 15th arrived with characteristic Portland winter weather, gray and drizzling and somehow appropriate for the end of an era. I spent the morning creating final backups of Morrison Properties data and preparing detailed documentation that would help them understand their systems even after I was no longer available to provide support. At exactly 5 p.m., I logged into the Morrison Properties administrative dashboard for the last time. The termination process I'd designed was elegant in its simplicity. With a few clicks, I revoked my access credentials, transferred administrative privileges to Margaret Wu's account, and activated the 30-day countdown to system deactivation. Morrison Properties would continue functioning normally for another month, giving them time to implement alternative solutions if they moved quickly and cooperatively. But my active support and maintenance would end immediately, and any technical problems that arose would become their responsibility to resolve. I sent a final email to Morrison Properties board confirming that the termination had taken effect and wishing them success in their future endeavors. The message was professional, courteous, and final. I had no intention of gloating over their difficulties or prolonging conflicts that had already consumed too much emotional energy. The weeks that followed were remarkable for what didn't happen. Patricia didn't call to apologize or acknowledge that the family had made mistakes. Michael didn't reach out to discuss lessons learned or express regret about missed opportunities for constructive resolution. Robert maintained his characteristic silence, apparently hoping the entire situation would resolve itself without requiring him to take any position or make any difficult decisions. The Morrison family had chosen pride over pragmatism, and they were about to discover that technological infrastructure didn't respond to arrogance or entitlement. Systems that had functioned flawlessly under my management began experiencing problems within days of my departure. Database errors accumulated without regular maintenance. Security vulnerabilities went unpatched. Automated processes failed without skilled troubleshooting. Margaret Wu called me twice during the first week after termination, asking for guidance on technical issues that were beyond her expertise. I provided general advice as a professional courtesy, but I declined her requests for hands-on troubleshooting or system repair. Those services were no longer part of my relationship with Morrison Properties, and I wouldn't provide them without appropriate compensation arrangements. By the end of January, Morrison Properties was experiencing serious operational difficulties. Rent payments weren't processing correctly. Maintenance requests weren't being routed to appropriate contractors. Financial reports contained errors that made accurate business analysis impossible. The family was discovering that replacing me wasn't just expensive and time-consuming. It was essential for basic business continuity. The crisis deepened throughout February as the Morrison family struggled to implement solutions they didn't understand for problems they'd never anticipated. They hired 3 different consulting firms, each of which provided increasingly expensive estimates for system replacement and data recovery. The most optimistic proposal suggested they might have functioning alternatives within 6 months, assuming perfect cooperation and unlimited budget flexibility. But the real revelation came when Margaret Wu resigned from her position as family accountant. She'd worked with Morrison Properties for over 20 years, managing their books through good times and bad, and she'd never wavered in her commitment to professional excellence. Her departure was a clear signal that she'd lost confidence in the family's ability to manage their business effectively. Margaret's resignation letter, which Emma shared with me, was a masterpiece of professional diplomacy that nonetheless delivered a devastating assessment of Morrison family leadership. She wrote that recent developments had convinced her that Morrison Properties faced challenges that exceeded her expertise and comfort level. She wished the family success in their future endeavors but felt it was time for her to pursue opportunities with organizations that shared her commitment to operational excellence and professional development. Her letter was really about accountability, respect for expertise, and the consequences of taking essential services for granted. Margaret had watched the Morrison family dismiss and exploit my contributions for years, and she'd seen how that pattern of behavior had ultimately created an existential crisis for their business. She was distancing herself from people whose decision-making process had proven so fundamentally flawed. By March, the Morrison family empire was in full crisis mode. Property management had become chaotic without functioning software systems. Tenant complaints were multiplying as maintenance requests went unaddressed. Financial reporting was so unreliable that they couldn't accurately assess their cash flow or investment performance. The family was forced to liquidate assets to fund emergency consulting and system replacement efforts. Properties that had been generating steady rental income for decades were sold at below-market prices to raise capital for technological infrastructure they'd taken for granted when I was providing it for free. Patricia, who had spent years treating me like an incompetent charity case, was now paying consulting firms more money than she'd compensated me in 3 years of service. The irony was perfect, though I doubt she was capable of recognizing it. The final vindication came in April when I received a call from a commercial real estate attorney representing potential buyers for Morrison Properties' remaining assets. The family had decided to liquidate their entire portfolio rather than continue struggling with operational challenges they couldn't resolve. The attorney explained that the buyers were interested in purchasing Morrison Properties' remaining holdings as distressed assets, meaning they would pay significantly less than market value in exchange for accepting the complications associated with dysfunctional management systems and uncertain operational capacity. He asked whether I might be interested in providing consulting services to help the new owners rebuild the technological infrastructure that Morrison Properties had lost. The irony was exquisite. The Morrison family's systematic dismissal of my contributions had created an opportunity for me to work with their competitors on rebuilding exactly what they'd destroyed through their arrogance and entitlement. I told the attorney I would consider consulting arrangements with the new ownership group, and that my rates for external clients were significantly higher than what I'd charge for family projects. The difference between my new consulting fees and what the Morrison family had paid me over 3 years was approximately $47,000 annually. But the real measure of vindication wasn't financial. It was watching people who'd treated me with contempt face the consequences of their own choices while maintaining my dignity throughout the entire process. I hadn't needed to sabotage or attack them. I'd simply withdrawn my subsidization of their lifestyle and let market forces demonstrate the true value of what they'd been taking for granted. The Morrison Properties liquidation was completed in June, marking the end of a commercial real estate empire that had taken my grandfather 50 years to build. Patricia, Michael, Jennifer, and Robert each received settlement payments that were significantly smaller than what they would have inherited if they'd treated my contributions with appropriate respect. The family trust that was supposed to provide generational wealth was reduced to a fraction of its former value. The Morrison name disappeared from Portland's commercial real estate landscape. Properties that had been family legacy became assets owned and managed by people who understood the importance of treating technical expertise as a strategic resource rather than a convenient service. Emma was the only family member who reached out to me after the liquidation was finalized. She thanked me for demonstrating that dignity and self-respect were more important than maintaining relationships with people who didn't value your contributions. She said watching this entire crisis unfold had taught her lessons about business, family, and personal integrity that she would carry throughout her life. She also told me she'd been following the career trajectory of the consulting firm that had purchased Morrison Properties' remaining assets. The new company was thriving under management that invested appropriately in technological infrastructure and treated technical professionals with the respect and compensation their expertise deserved. Emma's message concluded with something that brought this entire saga full circle. She said she'd been visiting my grandfather's grave regularly since the family crisis began, and that she thought he would have been proud of how I'd handled the situation. She believed he would have supported my decision to withdraw my services from people who'd consistently failed to recognize their value. Her words reminded me that this conflict had never been about money, revenge, or family drama. It had been about honoring the principles my grandfather had taught me about dignity, self-respect, and the importance of being fairly compensated for valuable contributions. The Morrison family had forgotten those principles in their pursuit of maintaining comfortable lives subsidized by other people's undervalued labor. They'd treated inheritance as entitlement and confused financial security with personal worth. Their empire had crumbled not because I'd sabotaged them, but because they'd built their success on a foundation of exploitation that eventually became unsustainable. Today, I run my own technology consulting firm specializing in property management systems for commercial real estate companies throughout the Pacific Northwest. My clients pay market rates for professional services, treat my expertise with appropriate respect, and understand that technological infrastructure is essential to modern business success. I drive a reliable car, live in a comfortable apartment, and maintain professional relationships based on mutual respect rather than family obligation. The Morrison family money that once seemed so important to everyone around me has been replaced by something far more valuable: the knowledge that I'm valued for my contributions and treated with the dignity that every professional deserves. The $50 million I'd mentioned at the beginning of this story wasn't just about the value of my inheritance stake or the damages from systematic undercompensation. It represented the total cost to the Morrison family of learning that dignity and expertise aren't negotiable commodities, and that some relationships are too expensive to maintain at the price of your self-respect. Sometimes the most powerful victory isn't getting what you want from people who've mistreated you. Sometimes it's simply walking away and building something better with people who understand your worth from the beginning. 5 years later, I stood in the lobby of the newly constructed Chen Technology Center in downtown Portland, watching sunlight stream through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Willamette River. The building housed my consulting firm's headquarters, along with offices for 12 other technology companies that specialized in everything from artificial intelligence to renewable energy management systems. The space buzzed with the kind of innovative energy my grandfather would have recognized and appreciated, even though the technology would have seemed like science fiction to his generation. The invitation in my hand was printed on expensive cardstock with elegant typography, requesting my presence at the grand opening of Morrison Memorial Gardens, a public park being dedicated in honor of my grandfather's contributions to Portland's development. The irony wasn't lost on me that the remaining Morrison family members were using my grandfather's legacy to rehabilitate their reputation after the spectacular collapse of their business empire. Patricia's signature appeared at the bottom of the invitation, though I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she was living much more modestly now, having sold her West Hills estate and moved to a condominium in Lake Oswego. Michael had relocated to Phoenix, where he worked for a commercial real estate firm as a mid-level manager rather than a family heir. Robert had quietly disappeared from Portland society entirely, apparently preferring anonymity to the embarrassment of explaining how one of the city's most successful family businesses had disintegrated so completely. Jennifer was the only family member who had managed to maintain her lifestyle, primarily through her marriage to Seattle money that remained insulated from the Morrison Properties disaster, but even she had withdrawn from Portland's social circles, apparently preferring to avoid questions about how her family had managed to squander a $200 million legacy through systematic arrogance and poor decision-making. The invitation represented an attempt at reconciliation that came approximately 4 years too late to matter. Patricia was hoping that public association with my grandfather's memory might restore some credibility to the Morrison name, while simultaneously creating an opportunity to approach me about potential collaboration on future projects. Her strategy was transparent and predictable, but it also demonstrated that she still fundamentally misunderstood the nature of our relationship and the reasons for its termination. I walked through the Chen Technology Center's common areas, past conference rooms where my employees were collaborating with clients on projects that ranged from smart building management to predictive analytics for urban planning. The company I'd built from the ashes of the Morrison family crisis now employed 37 people and generated annual revenue that exceeded what Morrison Properties had produced during its best years. More importantly, every employee received market-rate compensation, equity participation, and the kind of professional respect that I'd never experienced during my years of subsidizing the Morrison family lifestyle. The success felt satisfying not because of its scale, but because of its foundation. Chen Technology had been built on principles my grandfather would have recognized: fair dealing, innovation, and mutual respect between all participants. Our clients paid appropriate fees for professional services, our employees were compensated based on their contributions rather than their family connections. Our business relationships were structured around performance and results, rather than personal loyalty or social obligations. The contrast with Morrison family dynamics couldn't have been more stark. Where they had operated through entitlement and exploitation, we functioned through merit and reciprocity. Where they had taken essential services for granted, we invested in the people and systems that made our success possible. Where they had confused inheritance with achievement, we measured value through concrete contributions to shared objectives. My phone buzzed with a text message from Emma, who was now in her junior year at Portland State University pursuing a double major in computer science and business administration. She'd maintained our relationship despite the family crisis, visiting my office occasionally for informal mentoring conversations about technology careers and entrepreneurship. Her message asked whether I'd received the invitation to the Memorial Park dedication and whether I was planning to attend. Emma's question carried weight beyond simple curiosity. She'd become the unofficial family historian for her generation, documenting the rise and fall of Morrison Properties as a cautionary tale about the dangers of taking success for granted. Her senior thesis project was examining how family businesses navigate technological transitions, using our conflict as a case study in what happens when established power structures fail to adapt to changing professional requirements. Her academic work had revealed patterns that extended far beyond the Morrison family experience. Generational wealth frequently created environments where inherited privilege was confused with earned competence, where family loyalty was used to justify exploitative business relationships, and where technological expertise was systematically undervalued because it threatened traditional authority structures. Emma's research had also identified successful counterexamples, family businesses that managed to evolve by recognizing and rewarding expertise regardless of its source, by compensating contributions based on market value rather than relationship dynamics, and by treating professional services as strategic investments rather than family obligations. I responded to Emma's text by suggesting we meet for coffee to discuss her thesis research and the broader implications of what we'd both learned from watching the Morrison empire collapse. Her work was contributing to academic understanding of family business dynamics in ways that might help other families avoid the mistakes that had destroyed my grandfather's legacy. The Memorial Park dedication was scheduled for the following weekend, giving me time to consider whether attending would serve any constructive purpose. Part of me was curious to see how Patricia would handle the public event, whether she would acknowledge the family's role in destroying what my grandfather had built, and whether she had gained any insight into the consequences of systematic dismissal and exploitation. But a larger part of me recognized that Patricia's motivations for organizing the event were probably self-interested rather than genuinely honorific. She was trying to rehabilitate the Morrison name by associating it with my grandfather's legitimate accomplishments, while simultaneously distancing herself from the failures that had characterized family leadership since his death. I decided to attend the dedication, not because I owed the Morrison family anything, but because my grandfather deserved recognition for his genuine contributions to Portland's development. He had built something valuable through honest work and fair dealing, and his memory shouldn't be diminished by his descendants' subsequent failures. The Memorial Park was located on a piece of land my grandfather had donated to the city decades earlier, with the stipulation that it be used for public recreation and community gathering. The space had been beautifully developed, with walking paths, native plant gardens, and a small amphitheater where families could gather for outdoor events. A bronze plaque near the main entrance told the story of my grandfather's vision for creating shared spaces where people from all backgrounds could enjoy Portland's natural beauty. The dedication ceremony attracted a larger crowd than I'd expected, including many people who had worked with my grandfather during his active years in real estate development. Former employees, business partners, city officials, and community leaders gathered to share memories of a man who had approached business as a form of civic engagement rather than personal enrichment. Patricia spoke briefly during the formal program, reading prepared remarks that focused on my grandfather's generosity and community spirit, while carefully avoiding any mention of what had happened to the business empire he'd built. Her presentation was professionally delivered, but emotionally hollow, lacking the genuine affection and understanding that characterized other speakers' tributes. Michael attended but didn't participate in the program, standing at the back of the crowd with the uncomfortable posture of someone who wanted to appear supportive while avoiding too much attention. Jennifer made a brief appearance before leaving early, apparently satisfied that she'd fulfilled her social obligations without risking awkward conversations about family history. The most meaningful moment of the ceremony came when Margaret Wu stepped forward to share her memories of working with my grandfather during the early years of Morrison Properties. She spoke about his commitment to treating all employees with dignity, his insistence on fair compensation for quality work, and his belief that business success should create opportunities for everyone involved rather than concentrating wealth among a privileged few. Margaret's remarks implicitly critiqued everything that had happened to Morrison Properties after my grandfather's death, though she was too professional to make the comparison explicit. Her words reminded everyone present of the values that had made the original success possible and highlighted how completely those principles had been abandoned by subsequent generations. After the formal program ended, Patricia approached me with the kind of carefully casual manner that suggested she'd been planning this conversation for weeks. She thanked me for attending and said she hoped the memorial would help preserve my grandfather's legacy for future generations. Her tone carried undertones of reconciliation, as if attending the ceremony represented forgiveness for past conflicts. She mentioned that she'd been following Chen Technologies' growth and success, expressing admiration for what I'd accomplished since leaving the family business. Her comments felt like preparation for a request, probably involving some form of collaboration or consultation that would allow her to benefit from my expertise while maintaining plausible deniability about the family's previous treatment. I thanked Patricia for organizing the memorial event and acknowledged that my grandfather would have appreciated the community recognition, but I also made clear that my attendance was about honoring his memory rather than resuming any kind of relationship with the Morrison family. I explained that I'd moved forward with my life and career in ways that didn't include revisiting past conflicts or relitigating old grievances. Patricia's expression revealed disappointment, though she tried to maintain her composed demeanor. She had clearly hoped that time and success might have softened my position about family relationships, perhaps creating opportunities for the kind of mutually beneficial collaboration that could help restore Morrison family fortunes. Her miscalculation demonstrated that she still didn't understand the fundamental issues that had led to our break. This had never been about temporary anger or hurt feelings that might heal with time and success. It had been about incompatible values regarding dignity, respect, and fair compensation for professional contributions. Emma joined our conversation as it was winding down, providing natural transition away from the awkward dynamics between Patricia and me. She had clearly grown into herself during her college years, developing the kind of confident intelligence that suggested she would avoid repeating her family's mistakes in her own career and relationships. She asked whether I'd be willing to participate in her thesis defense presentation, sharing insights about technology business development and family enterprise management. Her invitation represented the kind of intellectual engagement that felt meaningful and constructive, focused on learning rather than litigation and growth rather than grievance. I agreed to contribute to Emma's academic work, seeing it as an opportunity to help her understand business principles that could guide her future decisions regardless of what career path she ultimately chose. Her research was contributing to broader understanding of how families could successfully navigate technological transitions while maintaining both business success and relationship integrity. As the dedication ceremony concluded and people began dispersing back to their regular weekend activities, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that Christmas dinner 5 years earlier when Patricia had dismissed my career as playing with computers. The dismissal that was intended to diminish me had ultimately catalyzed the most productive and satisfying period of my professional life. Chen Technology now managed property systems for over 200 commercial real estate companies throughout the Pacific Northwest, providing the kind of sophisticated technological infrastructure that the Morrison family had taken for granted until they lost it. Our clients appreciated our expertise, compensated our services appropriately, and understood that technological sophistication was essential to modern business competitiveness. The success felt meaningful not because it represented revenge against people who had mistreated me, but because it demonstrated that dignity and self-respect were compatible with professional achievement and financial prosperity. I hadn't needed to compromise my values or accept exploitative relationships to build something valuable and sustainable. The memorial park where we stood represented everything my grandfather had valued about community engagement and shared prosperity. The bronze plaque honoring his contributions would outlast the family conflicts that had consumed so much energy over the past 5 years. His legacy would be measured by the positive impact he'd had on Portland's development, rather than by his descendants' failure to maintain the business empire he'd built. Walking back to my car after the ceremony, I realized that attending the dedication had provided closure in ways I hadn't anticipated. Seeing Patricia struggle to maintain her dignity while acknowledging my grandfather's achievements reminded me that consequences and accountability were often their own forms of justice, more satisfying than any confrontation or vindication. The Morrison family had learned that technological expertise couldn't be dismissed or exploited indefinitely without serious consequences. They had discovered that dignity and self-respect weren't negotiable commodities that could be purchased with incremental improvements to inadequate compensation. Most importantly, they had experienced firsthand that some relationships were too expensive to maintain at the price of fundamental values. Emma walked with me toward the parking area, continuing our conversation about her thesis research and her plans for after graduation. She mentioned that several technology companies had expressed interest in hiring her after she completed her degree, and that she was particularly excited about opportunities to work on projects that combine technical innovation with social impact. Her career trajectory represented everything the Morrison family crisis had taught about the importance of recognizing and developing talent regardless of its source. Emma had learned that expertise was valuable, that fair compensation was essential, and that professional relationships should be based on mutual respect rather than family obligation or inherited privilege. She also mentioned that she'd been corresponding with Margaret Wu about potential collaboration on a consulting project focused on helping family businesses develop more effective technology strategies. Their partnership would combine Emma's technical knowledge with Margaret's decades of experience managing complex family enterprise finances. The collaboration represented exactly the kind of professional relationship that could have emerged from the Morrison family crisis if the family had been capable of learning from their mistakes, rather than simply enduring their consequences. Instead of recognizing expertise and adjusting their approach accordingly, they had chosen pride over pragmatism and lost everything they might have preserved through humility and fair dealing. As I drove home through Portland's familiar neighborhoods, past buildings and developments that my grandfather had helped shape during his active years, I felt a profound sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication. The Memorial Park dedication had reminded me that some legacies transcend the failures of individual inheritors, and that positive impact can outlast the people who create it. My grandfather's contributions to Portland would be remembered long after the Morrison family business collapse had been forgotten. His values of hard work, innovation, and fair dealing had survived in the company I'd built, and the relationships I'd developed with clients who appreciated expertise and compensated it appropriately. The Chen Technology Center represented those values in contemporary form, creating economic opportunities for employees while providing essential services to clients who understood that technological infrastructure was strategic rather than peripheral to business success. We had built something sustainable by treating people with dignity and structuring relationships around mutual benefit rather than exploitation. 5 years after walking away from the Morrison family Christmas dinner, I had everything that money couldn't buy: professional respect, personal dignity, and the satisfaction of building something valuable on a foundation of principles rather than privilege. The $50 million that the Morrison family had lost through their arrogance was ultimately less important than the self-respect I'd gained by refusing to accept systematic diminishment and exploitation. Sometimes the most powerful victory isn't defeating people who've mistreated you. Sometimes it's simply building something better with people who understand your worth from the beginning, and letting time demonstrate the consequences of their choices, while you focus on creating positive impact through work that reflects your values. The Memorial Park would stand as a reminder that legacy is earned through contribution rather than inherited through relationship, and that some achievements are too meaningful to be diminished by the failures of people who come afterward. My grandfather had built something lasting, and I had honored his memory by refusing to accept anything less than the dignity and respect that all professional contributions deserve. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.